Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about DNS or domain name system. Now I'm recording this video to sort of recall what I have learned about domain name system. So I might be a little mistaken about some things, but I'm going to try anyway just to refresh my own knowledge. Now, domain name system, let's start with the basics. Excuse me. Let's assume that you are on your web browser and you want to visit a website. Google.com, and your browser doesn't really know where to go to get that website, and what your browser really needs is the IP address of whatever website or domain you want to visit. Let's talk about IP addresses just very briefly. So you might have seen IP addresses out in the wild whenever you have been using the internet. And what IP addresses are, basically they are these unique sequence of numbers that are used to identify a device on a network. And that network can be the internet or any other local network. So basically these IP addresses are used to sort of identify what device is on that network. And so if your browser wants to visit, or if you want to visit Google from your browser, it really needs to know what the IP address of the server, basically the computer where the google.com files are, what the IP address is. Your browser needs that IP address. Now, how is it going to find out that IP address? The first thing it's going to do is going to talk to the DNS resolver that is on your local machine. And the local DNS resolver has this cache, access to this cache that has stored the IP addresses of the recent or most frequent websites that you have visited. And if you have visited google.com recently in the past, it's going to already know the IP address from the cache, and it's going to visit that IP address. But let's say if the IP address is not found in the cache, what is your browser going to do then? Then it's going to talk to a public DNS server, and this public DNS server, or a DNS resolver more specifically, is called a recursive DNS resolver because it's going to constantly query other servers until it finds the IP address. And this can be Google's or any other. There are a lot of public DNS servers that your machine has access to. Now, the public DNS resolver also has a cache, and if the IP address of the website that you want to visit is in the cache, it gets sent to your client, your browser, right away. But if it's not there, there are a series of steps that the public DNS resolver takes to find out the IP address. Now, the first thing it does, actually, before we get there, let's talk about the domain name a little bit. So this is the URL or the domain that you usually type in to your browsers, and there are three main parts for of this. So this one, the part that is after the last dot, is called a TLD, or a top level domain. And basically this can be a general top level domain like .com, .org, .gov, .shop, .store. You might already be familiar with a lot of these, or it can be a country specific TLD like .ca for Canada, .us for USA, .pk for Pakistan, and like that there are TLDs for almost all countries. So it can be either of these. And then this part, which is actually the name of the website, is called an SLD, a secondary level domain. And what this is, well, I've already told you what it is. It's the name of the website. And then this part is called a subdomain. And it basically divides the main domain. This is the main domain into different parts. So it can be store.website.com, it can be mail.website.com, for it can be blog.website.com, it can be anything. You can set it up to be anything, it doesn't really matter. But this is the basic breakdown of a domain name. Anyway, the first step that the public DNS resolver will take if it can't find the IP address of the domain that the client is requesting on its cache is going to query a server in the DNS that is called a root server. Now, root servers are sort of like the bosses in the DNS system. They are managed by large organizations such as NASA or the US military or the ICANN. And what they do is they return the address of a TLD server. They won't directly tell you the IP address of the domain that you want, but they'll tell you based on the TLD of the domain that you want. So if you want a .com domain, it will tell you, okay, this is the address of a TLD domain that manages all .com records. So the next step in the journey will be querying a TLD server. The public or the DNS resolver is going to then query the TLD server that is responsible for the .com domains, and it's going to ask if it knows the IP address of the domain that you want. And it's not going to, but what it does have is the address of the name server, the authority authoritative, I hope I spelled that correctly, the authoritative name server. And it's going to tell the resolver the address of the authoritative name server that manages the domain that you are looking for. So it manages the records for google.com domain. And now your DNS resolver can finally query that authoritative name server because it has the this is the server that actually knows the IP address of the authoritative name server. It knows the IP address of the domain that you want and is going to return that IP address that is going to get stored in the cache as well and then return to the client. Now, how does an authoritative name server actually know the IP addresses? Well, an authoritative name server has what is called zone files, and it manages all the information about the domain in the zone files. And a zone file has what are known as DNS records. And if you've ever purchased a domain, you might already be familiar with these. These are different types of records like CNAME records, A records, quadruple A records, MX records, and so on. So what each record is, it carries a tiny detail about that domain, maybe its subdomain, its IPv4 address, its IPv6 address, and so on. So your domain resolver looks in the A record, and this is what tells it the IP address of the domain that you want to visit. So this is sort of the overall process that falls under the domain name system and how the resolution of an IP address from the domain name occurs.